Okay, it is 12:02. Should we get going? Yeah, great. Welcome, everybody, and maybe people will trickle in as we keep going. My name is Keith Gessen. I teach over at the journalism school over there. Okay, I teach over there. Once I get outside, I'll have a better sense. I also write about Russia and Ukraine and other in the region more generally. I also at the journalism school run something called Delacorte Center for Magazine Journalism, which is a co-sponsor of this event. And I'm very excited to introduce Joshua Yaffa, whose work I'm sure you all know. He's been reporting from Russia and Ukraine for years, and in particular in the past year has been doing terrific reporting from Ukraine. So I'm going to ask him some questions. Since this is a jointly sponsored Harriman and journalism school event, I'll be asking some journalism questions as well as some Harriman questions. And you are a graduate of
Both.
Yeah. So you got the Harriman certificate?
Well, no, I'm one. I don't know what it's called in academia. I forget when you like not everything but the certificate.
Okay.
So I was
everything. That's what it's called, I think.
I think at this point, I much can attest. I've been sort of subtly or quietly considered an alumni, without having the anyone were to come into my closet. They wouldn't have the document to prove it.
Is it one class that you can say?
I forget what
come back and do the
maybe
class.
I'll take it to sabbatical
Okay,
finally
good.
sort it out. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, thank you for coming. So back to your old school.
Mm-hmm.
In fact. Oh, yeah. So, so my first question, just I wanted to kind of hear about the past year, and even a little bit before that. So you were in Moscow for
10 years.
10 years,
almost 10 years and 7 days.
Okay. And then you were in Kyiv.
I flew to Kyiv on February 8th.
Okay.
2022.
Because by then you had a pretty good sense that,
or something, yeah. I was maybe not a war skeptic or invasion skeptic, but I was admittedly slow to come to that realization or to have that be my leading hypothesis. So it was. I wrote some pieces. I don't think they were skeptical, but they also weren't maximally alarmist or confident in invasion in December and January. But by February, I was becoming more worried / convinced, and felt like it was time to go get a sense of things from Ukraine and potentially be in place where something to happen, but also just get a sense of what people were thinking and saying there, because I have pieces that were more from either Washington's or Moscow's perspective, and thought it was time to get the Ukrainian one, and so went to Kyiv with that kind of vague aim at the beginning of February.
So I have a question about that. So so as you say, you were in Moscow, and I went to Moscow in January of 2022, and I was really struck by the fact that nobody thought there was going to be war. Nobody.
Including not just like the random man on the street of the Banya or something, but like the leading experts, independent experts, and these are not necessarily pro-Kremlin people, but like the leading minds we all went to for years to understand Russian foreign policy.
Yes. And whereas in the US and in Washington, people were really quite, had a high degree of confidence that there would be a war. What was it like in Kyiv?
Also, not maybe skeptical isn't quite the right word, but not panicked, a kind of almost purposeful indifference, like a kind of proud indifference, right? That we're not going to let the Russians scare us or lead us into a panic. And there wasn't, it didn't feel naive at all. It wasn't that there was like a lack of understanding or imagination about what Russia was capable of and what its intentions might be toward Ukraine. But I think at that point, it still felt kind of unimaginable what actually was to come. Right? It was just a difficult thing to imagine at the start of 2022. And if anything, a lot of people in Ukraine it felt like to me had this combination of a kind of purposeful, proud sense of we're not going to let Putin throw us into a panic, and also, I guess it's a related feeling or different manifestation of the same one, like we're not going to fall for this Russian kind of provocation or manipulation. We shouldn't be forced to give Russia something at the barrel of a gun because they're going around implicitly threatening war.
I mean, and they'd also been threatening war for years. I mean, there've been, the troops that have been at the border multiple times. So that must have been part of it.
And the last thing, which is very pronounced, especially when you talk to official people in the Zelensky administration and around it, was a frustration also directed at the United States, which they felt like was building up this feeling of panic or inevitability about invasion that was not matched with what they thought would be then the kind of obvious or implicit set of forms of aid, first and foremost military, that would be expected to come. In other words, like, you're telling us we're about to be destroyed here, but like, what? Okay, and then and what are you doing about it? Nothing. So there was some bewilderment and frustration on the part of Zelensky and people around him.
And when did you meet with Zelensky?
No, I profiled him for the New Yorker in 2019, I guess. A friend and colleague in the room, Simon Schuster, later can speak to Zelensky at wartime, a forthcoming book on the subject. So he spent a lot of time in the presidential quarters with Zelensky. I came in and out to talk to people in the administration around him, but no, haven't had a one-on-one sit down with him, neither on the eve of the invasion nor since, but got a, I think, pretty good sense of the mood of the place from people around him.
So if you just walk me through like the sort of the last kind of year. So you were in Kyiv starting February 8th, and then you left right on the eve, or
No,
you were staying.
Yeah, sure. At the time, speaking also of this pre-war period, when it became more and more clear, at least to me, that something was going to happen, there was going to be some sort of military escalation. I and others thought it would start, or had the likelihood of starting, in the Donbas, where the war was ongoing in 2014, and sort of spread from there, that Putin would try to create the pretext for a larger invasion by some sort of either provocation or basically sparking a renewed round of fighting in Donbas that would then spread. So I went to Donbas around February 20th and was in Kramatorsk on February 24th. And Kramatorsk itself was bombed early in the morning. And so that's where the war for me began. And from there, went through Dnipro to Kyiv and stayed in Kyiv through, I guess, the middle of March.
Okay.
And then by then, I returned not to Moscow, but to Yerevan, Armenia, where I spent actually a really wonderful, given the circumstances, several months, although I went back to Ukraine from Yerevan, but Yerevan I'd been before, but turns out even more than I expected. It's actually a very pleasant, lovely, welcoming place to live. I've developed very fond feelings for Yerevan over those months. But back and forth to Ukraine, and then over the summer to Berlin, which is a more quasi-permanent move, while still going in and out of Ukraine from there.
Okay. And did you have what did you do with your Moscow life?
Well, nothing. I mean, well, if you mean like physically,
Yes.
Yes. So I was able to ship stuff to Berlin that took many, many months, but did arrive. But more experientially or something. The Moscow life that I had for 10 years disappeared, or largely disappeared with the war. In other words, the people I knew largely scattered, not everyone, but enough that like there was no longer, right, but to talk about the kind of community I had before the war wasn't there. And from what I understand, the mood of the place, at least in the circles I largely was in, also has shifted rather dramatically, and in a way that makes it easier just in terms of my life, leaving aside my reportorial or journalistic duties, but just as a person who lived in Moscow for 10 years and made a life there. One thing that always didn't exactly keep me there, but I knew if I were to have left I would have felt nostalgic about is actually the secret or not secret is that, is like Moscow in the 2000s, 2010s was a really fun, interesting, cool place to live. A very high quality of life, however paradoxical that may sound to some. I thought if I leave, like the party will go on without me, so to speak. Like everyone else is gonna like keep hanging out, having a great time, and there's gonna be all these interesting people in this interesting city, and I'll be sitting somewhere else, missing all of that. So that's not the case. All of that I would have missed is sort of gone anyway. Which not that this is the primary tragedy or concern of the last year, but that does make it easier to know that the Moscow I knew has just been kind of atomized. It's been blown to pieces. It's not a thing that still exists, and only I don't have access to it anymore.
So, so you've been sort of going in and out of Ukraine every couple months, or how do you do? And
Yeah.
How long do you go for? What's your?
Depends. I've gone for as long as that first time I was there for 6 weeks. I've gone back for as long as a month. This last time I was there, it was just over 2.5 weeks. 2.5. Saw your sister. We crossed paths. Had lunch in Kyiv. They were on their way to Kharkiv. So it depends. It depends on the one hand, what I'm doing and how much time the journalistic task takes, but also how much time I have, right? There's other life considerations. I went to the US planned. I was in California at home for a while. So there was that time pressure on the back end, but it depends on the scope of what I'm doing, really.
And how much do you plan in advance for? How are you? I mean, one kind of journalistic question is: there's so much work being done right now in Ukraine, and some of it's quite good, right? The Times is doing a very good job. How do you sort of think about? Okay, I'm gonna do this longer piece. How do you kind of choose it, conceptualize it?
I mean, it's gotten easier, just to speak purely selfishly, as the war has gone on, because I felt less pressure to force myself awkwardly and not entirely successfully into being a news reporter. The first days of the war, although I did end up writing a long magazine story about the opening weeks of the war, I felt like it would be absurd and almost a kind of dereliction of journalistic duty to just like write nothing for 3 weeks or a month after Russia invades Ukraine, and then just come out with this piece in some weeks. So I felt like I should be publishing, maybe not quite in real time, but with the metabolism of almost a newspaper reporter, which I've never been, and don't think I'm particularly good at. But that was also a time, as David Gremnick, the editor of the New Yorker, tried to calm me. I think this was partially actual editorial advice and partially just psychotherapy. But he told me, this is like on day 2 or 3 of the war, when I just arrived to Kyiv. It would have been day 3 of the war. It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, everything is interesting. You don't need to like find a story. Just like go outside, and the first person you talk to is already interesting for us. And that is kind of true, or was then. That just Kyiv in those days, surrounded by Russian troops and unclear, would it fall, would it not fall? It was interesting. Just what the trip to the grocery store was interesting. So that there was like a combination of the pressure of feeling like I need to produce now and at a pace I'm not used to, because the story has the urgency of the story demands that. But at the same time, what kind of lessened the pressure, thankfully, was that I didn't need to hunt around for some exclusive or particularly like overly complicated in its execution story. And as time has gone on, those two things have then shifted, but in ways that still balance out. In other words, now you do have to be a lot more thoughtful, rigorous about what you're writing about. I don't think it would be particularly journalistically interesting to just walk around Kyiv and bump into random people and write about what they tell you on year, already 2 of the war. So that makes it harder, but what compensates for that is now that you get the time back, that I don't feel like I need to publish every 3 days. And so there's more time to let the story develop. There's more time. The most important thing for me is to report the story. I'm just not very efficient at that phase. I'm not efficient at any phase, really, writing either. But I do try to have a rough or even more than rough idea of what it is I want to write about before I go in. I mean, of course, the actual execution of the story can change, but usually the overall theme doesn't. I stick to what I thought I wanted to write about before I go in, and that's partially maybe just a sanity saving measure. Like otherwise, it's just it's so overwhelming, right? You just get to Ukraine and think like, okay, what do I want to write about? I mean, there's so many different things you could do, and the geography place. It's not a small country, so if you set your mind on Kharkiv, it's hard to be in Zaporizhzhia the next day. But it's more. It's not even just that logistical element. It's more kind of psychologically. Like I would be paralyzed if I woke up on day one in Ukraine and was starting to think about, okay, what do I want to write about? I need to have some sort of general focus or vector to get me going.
So you've done a couple of stories, at least about places that had been occupied by the Russian army. You went to Bucha and Violent and Melitopol. What was that like, entering those places?
Well, alas, I didn't go to Melitopol. I guess that I should be glad that there's some successful writerly obfuscation. If it read like I did, but Melitopol was and is occupied by the Russian army, and there's no way to get there, especially not for an American journalist. So that I reported. This is maybe like the J school part of the conversation from Zaporizhzhia, which is the kind of frontline regional capital that now accepts internal refugees coming from the south, at the time Mariupol, but also Melitopol. It's where the mayor in exile of Melitopol has his office, where the whole city administration of Melitopol is, and there's a remarkable local journalist from Melitopol who had to flee, who ended up in Zaporizhzhia. So that story I reported from the outside, but also talking with people, thanks to Telegram. The messaging app works there, or did. I don't know what actually the internet connectivity is like now, but the other places I went to, as you said, were places that had been occupied by the Russian army and then were liberated. The first round was in the spring outside of the Kyiv region, when the story really was about war crimes. First and foremost, that the Russian army wasn't in those places long enough to really establish a proper occupation regime. It was, the places were run in a rather disorganized and terrifying way by just the soldiers themselves who were stationed there, who were less concerned with administering a city. They weren't like trying to figure out trash collection or anything like that, right? They were stuck and confused and terrified and behaved extraordinarily brutally and criminally as a result. And later, I guess September, I went to the Kharkiv region, where I ended up writing a long story about Izum and the experience of occupation in Izum, and specifically the question of collaboration in Izum and who among the locals chose to or was forced to collaborate, and how you navigate those questions, ultimately unknowable, and also what's happening to them now. What is the Ukrainian state doing to them, or how's the Ukrainian state treating them? How are their neighbors treating them? But that was a very different story of occupation. Izum was under occupation for more than half a year, and there was a real proper occupation administration. There was a occupation mayor, there was a occupation water department, schools department, everything, culture department. And so there you had something like kind of, real life, quote unquote, going on for half a year, but in this really kind of bizarre looking glass and quite terrifying for many people form. And that was super interesting, but both to try and reconstruct what it was like to live under such circumstances, but even more so for me is how people wake up from that strange and terrible dream and make sense of what they went through and how they're going to live with one another again. Like the one anecdote or one story that I tell in that piece is about two neighbors, one of whom seemingly, I should say allegedly, denounced her neighbor to the Russian military as being a Ukraine supporter, as having had some ties to the territorial defense. And he was arrested, beaten, tortured, subject to electroshock, and subject to a mock execution. He was taken to the forest, told he was going to be shot. And when the Ukrainian army ultimately liberated Izium, so too is he released from his captivity and wanders home to now live across the street from this woman who denounced him. And everyone knows everything. It's a small enough place where she knows that he knows, and there are no ambiguities surrounding the circumstances of the summer. But how do these people live with each other now? That was maybe the most interesting question of all for me in that piece.
One thing that's one thing that's happened to a lot of people who write about Russia, who got into it because they were interested in Russian history or Russian culture and these kind of interesting questions, we've had to kind of, because Russia keeps starting wars, have to become kind of war correspondents, right? And how do you did you do any kind of training, or have you just kind of learned it on the fly? And how do you sort
A little bit of
of
everything. I actually took a class here at the journalism school on conflict reporting, which turned out to be more applicable than I had imagined at the time. But you're right that I'm a very accidental and in many ways unwilling or unwitting war correspondent. There are some people who seek that and are good at that and specialize in that, and a lot of them have come through Ukraine. People for whom Ukraine is another war rather than a part of the world that they've been interested in. How have I navigated that? I hope, I'm here, I'm healthy, right? So in that sense, I've managed to keep myself safe, which is not a small achievement. Yeah. One thing I've partially subconsciously, and I think it's later become more conscious, is that understanding what I'm comfortable with and what I'm good at. There's some overlap between the two. Maybe sometimes they can be one and the same, but I'm neither that particularly hot on the idea, nor do I think I'm the right man for the job to be sitting in a trench for days on end, being fired on by artillery. There's a friend and colleague at the New Yorker, Luke Mogelson. Perhaps some of you have read his stuff, but I recommend, if you're interested, you definitely take a look. He's been to Ukraine, I think, 3 times, and has written exactly those sorts of pieces, true war journalism about the fight itself and what it's like, what this particular war is like, and the particular dynamics and sort of tactile, experiential moments that he's captured have been really powerful. But that's just not my sort of thing. I don't think I'd be good at it. I certainly wouldn't enjoy it as much as one can enjoy that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So I've tried to use what are my skills. Language, first and foremost. I don't speak Ukrainian. I can understand it fairly well, but you can get around Ukraine with Russian decently well. Trying to learn some Ukrainian, but I'm not quite there in terms of actually myself being able to conduct an in-depth interview in Ukrainian. But knowledge of the language, knowledge of the place, its history, the culture, and trying to extract more human stories, I guess you could call them, that require time and a depth of understanding and connection with people. And the thing is, the story like Izium can only be done, well, one, just the nature of the story required that is all about the Russian army having left and people trying to put back together their lives. But repertorially or journalistically, like you can't have those kinds of conversations, because I have been in some limited circumstances on the front or close to the front where the war itself is happening, and no one's going to sit there for 3 hours with you. It's like it's not the time to put on the teapot and bare your soul. And I, not only does your subject not have the time or interest in that, I certainly don't, right? I'm more looking to like, when can we get out of here, rather than like, let's stay another hour. So for those reasons, temperamental and journalistic, I've tried to find stories off or away from the war itself, in the shadow of war, kind of lives. I don't know if it's possible to come up with, identify the genre, but kind of lives in the shadow of war, and that there's a lot of rich material there.
What have you what changes have you seen in the last year in Ukraine?
Like I said, I was there now, well, more than a couple of weeks ago, I guess, almost a month, and people were, I want to choose my words carefully, exhausted. I think that's a fair one to use. Dispirited, not in the sense that they were ready to throw up their hands and give up. I mean, that basically you don't hear from anyone, and not even give up, even something on like a partial on the road to giving up, even the idea of negotiating with Russia, giving something up to Russia, first and foremost territorially. That's something I didn't hear basically anywhere, and not just in my conversations in Kyiv with political type people. I just mean ordinary people all over the country, from Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk in the west to Kharkiv in the east. But certainly this kind of adrenaline fueled burst of confidence, patriotism, the weeks after the invasion, going through the summer, I think Ukrainians themselves were frankly a little bit amazed at what they were able to do, that the country didn't fall. And not only that, they were kind of, I don't know, quite beating the Russian army, but I mean, they were at minimum holding their own, and in just in demonstrable ways, whether in March and April outside of Kyiv or later in September, Kharkiv pushing back the Russian army. It felt like momentum was on their side. And that, of course, when you're winning or when the momentum is on your side, but of course, that's going to lead to confidence and enthusiasm. And now it doesn't feel that way anymore. It's not that Ukraine is losing per se, but the idea of a quick victory is just objectively not there, not happening, right? That people, maybe if they didn't quite with their brains think that that was the likely outcome, with their hearts, they allowed themselves to hope for it. And so it's obvious this is going to be a long war, and the toll of it, first and foremost, just in lives lost, is really mounting. And it was this trip in February when I was really struck by the degree to which death is kind of everywhere. And if in earlier trips all the way through the summer, of course, Ukrainian soldiers are dying, they're dying in high number, but it hadn't yet just penetrated my subjective kind of personal world, right? Or maybe, a couple soldiers I had known of or crossed paths with were killed. But in February, it not felt, it just was the case that just about everyone I talked to either had lost someone close or knew of someone who had recently been killed. I mean, it was just like the death really was, the conversation about death was much more omnipresent than I had ever felt it before. As a friend of mine in Kyiv remarked, it felt like by that point, death was one or two handshakes away, as she put it, that it was just kind of anywhere you turn, someone you knew or someone you knew who knew someone was dead. And that, of course, how can that not affect the individual and national psyche?
Attitudes toward Russia have obviously also, quite negative to begin with, but become more negative. And I mean, when you're speaking Russian throughout Ukraine, you were mostly perceived as an American journalist who was speaking Russian, right?
Yeah. Though in lots of places, I don't think this comes as any great surprise to anyone. Like you show up and the people in the place where you arrived are speaking Russian to one another.
Still?
Yeah.
Still.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, there's also shifts. I don't want to like paint too broad of a brush. Definitely, there's been a shift toward Ukrainian speaking. And here, I'm talking more about my social world than my journalistic one. People I've known, I've been reporting from Ukraine for just as long as I've been reporting from Russia, really, since 2012. So I've been going back and forth many times. And Kyiv, as you know and may remember, was more a Russian-speaking city than a Ukrainian one, and that began to shift. Was shifting in the years before the war, has definitely shifted dramatically since the invasion, and I noticed that just in terms of people I meet up for dinner and kind of check in with periodically. There's been a shift toward more Ukrainian, and at the table, if I'm out with a group of people, Ukrainian is more the common language than Russian. But that said, in the South and in the East, Russian is as common as ever. There's a soldier I've followed and written about since the start of the war. I checked back in with him in February when I was there just now. And he struggles to speak Ukrainian. I mean, struggles maybe a bit of exaggeration, but he's an awkward, imperfect Ukrainian speaker. But you've never met someone more patriotic, I think it's fair to say anti-Russian than this guy. He's and so the language question is interesting and matters, but also kind of doesn't.
What are your thoughts about what's going to happen next?
I'd like to appeal to the journalism school portion of the talk and say, I'm more comfortable talking about what has happened or at maximum is happening, but what will happen is thankfully not really our purview. But it does seem like, and this is not like a shock, I don't think, bit of insight to anyone in this room, that the war is going to go on for a while, and that both sides seem to think one side is wrong about this, right? So tragically, but both sides seem to think that they have more to gain by continuing to fight than by pausing or de-escalating anyway, by transitioning to a negotiation or political phase. That both sides think that they can eke out more advantage for themselves on the battlefield. Clearly, some sort of political process is coming, whether it's next month, next year, next decade. But in the way of all wars, I guess, both sides want their positions, first and foremost, just territorial positions, to be as advantageous as possible before that process begins. And both think that there's more to be gained by continuing to fight.
And more questions, but I would love to open that up to our
I have a
informed audience. Yes.
What do you think of collaborators who actually led to the invasion of the southern of Ukraine from the Crimea? Do you know about this?
Sure, like people in the SBU, for example, who either disappeared or been arrested. Clearly, I haven't looked into this specifically as a reporter, so I'm only telling you things that you may have already read yourself, but that clearly there were people within the government and security structures in the South who, to varying degrees, allowed for or collaborated with the Russian invasion, which is one reason why Russia, especially in the South, was able to take so much territory so fast, just in a matter of days. Those were the type of collaborators I was just personally less interested in, because I wanted to find people who occupied a much more complicated, nuanced, moral gray area, right? That if you work for the SBU, the Ukrainian security services, and you secretly collaborated with Russia to allow Russia to take more territory in the South, it's not really, I don't think, that complicated or interesting, at least as interesting a question. Whereas a school teacher in a town that was occupied, who hadn't been paid in months and who was frankly out of money or out of medicine for her mother. Also, at the time, in a place like Izum, many people thought this occupation would be indefinite. It wasn't just a question of one summer, but could be years, forever. That perhaps the kind of quote unquote right thing to do would be to go back to school and open it up so children could get an education, even if that meant teaching the Russian program. That sort of thing is much more complicated and therefore interesting for me than the person who really did, by all accounts, at least in some cases, commit effective treason by cooperating with the invasion, themselves being part of the military or security apparatus of Ukraine.
I would just add that Josh is the author of a terrific book about Russia, about the sort of people who are morally, in between.
Yeah, I guess I was both comfortable in and interested in moral ambiguity.
Yeah.
Maybe that is my macro subject to a certain degree.
So much about journalistic work is based on empathy, especially the kind of long reporting that you do. And of course, in a situation of war, the emotional toll that it takes is amped. So how do you deal with that?
I don't really have a systematic answer to that question. Maybe I should. When I was in Izum, part of the time I was in Izum, I was with a friend and colleague, a really talented Ukrainian journalist who I've known for many years. And we were going around together. She had her own interests and work to do in Izum, but sometimes we would meet with these kind of alleged or accused collaborators together. And it was striking how much she had I certainly mean her no disrespect by saying this. I'm in awe of her work before and during the war, but she had a much more emotional connection that was hard for her to hide or overcome in talking with these people, especially ones who kind of veered toward the more, maybe less ambiguous side of collaboration, right? Who by all accounts were were indeed pro-Russian, had indeed aided the Russian occupying forces, and it looked like they were less victims of circumstance than people who were kind of enthusiastically supported the Russian invasion. That like it was just hard for her to be a reporter with such people, and it wasn't for me. And I don't say that to point of the story is definitely not to kind of boast about how I keep my repertorial cool, but like it does help clearly, right? This is a case where being an outsider, again, Ukrainian journalists are able to do a lot that I can't and have an understanding of a place that I'll never have. So I don't want to suggest that somehow, foreign correspondents are kind of better at this work than locals. That's not the case at all. I wouldn't have been able to do much or really any of the work this past year without Ukrainian colleagues. But yeah, that was a case where I had clearly, without meaning to, it wasn't like I purposely flipped a switch to be like, okay, go into kind of unfeeling journalistic mode here to do this interview. It just didn't resonate with me, at least not nearly in the same way that it did with my friend. And it's probably the case like that throughout, that there is a healthy, it has some journalistic value, I think, but it also must have personal value. That there's a degree of just disassociation or something that I'm able to access, that this ultimately isn't, it's not my home. I mean, what would it be like reporting on the occupation of San Diego, where I grew up? I mean, that would be very different. It would be strange and terrible. And being back home, actually, just now, I thought about that. Like, what would it be like if like this place was occupied? And then I like showed up after like San Diego was occupied. That would be just very strange and difficult. And I would have a lot of emotions that I just don't have regarding Ukraine. I mean, I like to think that I remain empathetic on a human level to individual suffering, but somehow I guess I'm able to remain a reporter in ways that I, like I said, I think benefit the work and probably benefit me psychologically also.
I want to ask a more confrontational version of that question, which is, I mean, something I've always just kind of, I don't have an answer to it and I struggle with it, but like this problem of going somewhere where people are really suffering and knowing that at the end of that, you're going to write an article and go home. How do you kind of think about that?
Here I think of this piece I did from Chernihiv in April, which hadn't been occupied, it had been surrounded. It was a kind of mini Kyiv, but a much more brutal version of that, in that the Russian army wasn't able to actually enter Chernihiv, but they surrounded it and bombed it quite intensely, much more intensely than Kyiv. Actually, maybe the better comparison is a kind of mini Mariupol. And I went to Chernihiv maybe 3 or 4 days after the Russian army had pulled out, so the trauma was still very fresh, and just found that was a case where I could do the kind of journalistic thing of just wandering around. Just about anyone on the street had a remarkable, as in terrible story to tell. And I guess it's convenient for me to say as an answer to your question, but I felt like the moment we shared with these people, over the course of 2 days, I spoke to dozens of people whose homes had been destroyed, who had seen their relatives die in front of them, and shelling attacks, people in the hospital. There was a kind of infamous early attack in Chernihiv where a line for bread was hit with a cluster bomb and dozens of people died, and dozens more ended up in the hospital. And I found people who had survived that attack and who had seen people in the bread line in front of them blown to pieces. And it felt like they would rather I was there, even for a half hour, like with them at least, for them to tell their story. Because also in Chernihiv itself, like no one was interested in those days. It's not like the other people who survived the siege of Chernihiv. It wasn't like there was no one to do this kind of cathartic, if it even indeed if that's a fair word to use, work with. There was no one to tell your story to, or there was no one who's going to kind of listen with empathy and curiosity and patience to your story, because like they had their own terrible story. Everyone was traumatized. And so I'd like to think, but again, like I said, this is an easier, convenient answer for me to fall back on, that they benefited from, or it genuinely seemed to me like there was some small measure of relief in having this stranger show up who was outside of this situation, who could just sit and listen, who wanted to listen, who had the patience and just psychological fortitude to sit and listen. And they didn't expect anything of me, really. They certainly weren't under the illusion, I don't think, that talking to me and I would write this in the New Yorker and then suddenly their lives would materially benefit in any way. I don't think anyone had that idea, but they did want to talk. I mean, there were many, frankly. Chernihiv is one place. This happens a lot in Ukraine, where the day I was leaving Chernihiv, I had to get back to Kyiv. I had a train, like, kind of having to rush people, like the really awkward, sort of terrible moment, right? Of like people wanted to talk much more than I actually had the time for by the end of the day in Chernihiv. So I'd like to think that's a sign that people were getting something of value out of our exchange. That's a great answer.
Collaboration aside, I'm interested, what are some other gray areas that you came across in your reporting? Some other like moral dilemmas that were interesting. And then part 2 of this question is, what gray areas did you face in your own life, having built a life in Moscow, and you live in a circle of Russian reporters? I know you have a lot of Ukrainian reporter friends, but did some gray areas come up for you in that sense as well?
So I'll answer chronologically, which means in reverse order as you asked them. I'd like to think, I could be wrong, and I would be curious genuinely if someone could sort of point out in ways that I'm wrong or naive about my own life and work for a decade, but I really don't think that I made compromises as a journalist, was forced to or did so knowingly, or I guess unknowingly. I wouldn't the definition know about them. That's where you all can come in and point them out. But I had this sort of kind of like it was a point of pride, a kind of like punk ethos that like, I'm not gonna look over my shoulder. You know, I'll at the time, the risk for, now this has changed. And if I were to go back to Moscow and report, we can talk about that later, I might have a very different risk calculus. So this is all pre-war, but like, okay, so they'll kick me out. They won't extend my visa. So screw it. Like, I'm not gonna edit myself or watch what I say or choose carefully the topics I want to write about so that I don't suffer consequences. I'm just gonna like purposely and kind of aggressively ignore whatever the implications of my work may be, because I felt like, and having written about compromise myself, that like once you enter into that, it sort of sucks you in, and just like with lies, you know, one compromise leads to another, and suddenly you're making much bigger compromises than you started out making. So aware of that on the one hand, and also aware that like I wasn't really risking anything all that serious. Well then, no, like screw it. I'm not gonna engage in any compromise. I don't think. But again, maybe I did in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. In Ukraine, other moral gray areas, I'm not sure it's like a moral gray area, but and there's some reporting that has come out about this. There's a big piece that was discussed a lot in the Washington Post last week, but just about the both the condition and morale and attitude inside the Ukrainian army. Again, it's not a question, doesn't seem to be of morale dropping to the extent that like people don't want to be there or that they're questioning the value of the war. Not at all. The war continues to feel across Ukrainian society quite existential to most people, and it's not just rare, but truly I haven't found, and I've looked, right, or I'm open to this, the idea that I could find someone who would say like, well, this is just not worth it anymore. We have to make some concessions. The cost is too high. But I just haven't found such a person, even in the army, where of course the losses are the highest. That said, there is some murmuring or grumbling just about the way this is inevitable as the war goes on for a year, right? The people prosecuting it are going to start to grumble a bit about, you know, what their commanders are ordering them to do and what the political leadership, the policy and course that they're pursuing. So that will be an interesting story. Connected to it is the supply that the Ukrainian army is getting. There's been this, you know, I wrote a story for the New Yorker about the arming of Ukraine by the West. And that's been one huge kind of like strategic or macro theme of the war. But on the micro level, how much of that actually gets to the units that need it most, and how do people who actually prosecuting the war on the front feel about these bigger stories of tanks and rocket systems and stuff that we read about, but you know, where is it going and how is it being parceled out? But I think as the war goes on, all of that is going to be more interesting and more important, and that it made sense. I don't think this is like journalistic malpractice or that I and others were engaged in some sort of cover-up in the war's early days by writing about the invasion in pretty black and white terms, just about one country like invading another, and the country that was had suffered that invasion kind of fighting back in this way that was really remarkable and heroic, and in many cases unexpected, and that in those early days the story to write wasn't about the kind of grumblings inside the Ukrainian army, because there was also less of it in the war's early days. It was that like adrenaline moment when people were rallying around the idea of resistance and survival. So I don't think that it was a question we kind of missed the story. I think the story has just developed as the war has gone on.
Yeah, I'm going to use this unique chance to ask you a question. And I wanted to ask about your speakers and your like people who you knew back in Russia. And if there is anyone who stopped to talk to you, like, you know, answering your questions, or vice versa, maybe someone who were like pro Putin and then realized what happened and it's like became more like friendly. And the second question is about propaganda. Sometimes it looks like there is a huge red button named propaganda, and if you push this button and switch it off, like people in some magical way, Russia starts like will become normal people, I don't know, understand what happened in Ukraine. What do you think about the role of propaganda right now in Russia?
So on the first question, I have lost, if that's the right word, some sources and contacts. Again, I don't know, and I hope to get back to Moscow. I don't think that I haven't like written off reporting from Moscow for life, not at all. The opposite. I want to get there and plan to get there. And it might be different if I was to be on the ground, and that it's a question not of people refusing to talk to me, but not wanting to talk on the phone or over Messenger. So I don't know. It's like hard for me to figure out which it is. But there are definitely people who I was in semi-regular-ish contact with from, I mean, no one, the other thing is the people who have done journalism from Russia. No, it's not like, unless you all had sources I didn't, but it's not like for 10 years I was just on the phone with people in the Kremlin all the time, or like meeting them for coffee, outside of Red Square for them to fill me in on all the secret goings on in Putin's inner circle. So when I'm talking about losing sources, I mean, these are already people on the periphery of the power structure, but who, for reasons that are, I guess, understandable, felt like there wasn't really much in it for them anymore to maintain a correspondence with an American journalist, maybe specifically one who was largely at the time working in Ukraine. I don't know. I don't know hard to say what their motives were, because I don't have access to them. But I should say I didn't try super hard. There are a few people maybe I've like been more pushy with, but a lot of people, it was like, okay, it didn't answer my message or two messages, and but there have not been anyone in the second category, at least in my very subjective kind of network of contacts. No one has come out to me as having or emerged as a anti-Putin, anti-war figure who before was in the power structure in some way. That there are such people, obviously, right? So I don't even know how instructive of an answer that is, but just not in my personal set of contacts. But again, I don't know why they would. Well, maybe that's not true. Maybe maybe I'm not giving people enough credit. I mean, there are, of course, lots of in Russia are people who are quietly, anonymously skeptical of the war, but do quite literally nothing about that skepticism, and that's a big part of the problem, which gets to the more important second question you asked. So I guess maybe there are people who have, in subtle ways, let it be known that they're kind of not on board, but they certainly haven't broken with the system in a meaningful way, in a way that would actually, like, outwardly, right? I don't think they've changed, certainly not their position or their jobs. Propaganda, I'm skeptical. Well, propaganda in and of itself, can't change people's minds. I think what it's good at is further embedding or solidifying narratives that people already are inclined to believe, that fits with people's worldview and the idea of the West, the United States most of all, looking to either undermine or hold down, engage in various hostile activities regarding Russia. There's a pretty widespread belief in Russia long before the war. And if you look at polling by a place like Delacorte Center, which is even before the war was just about literally the only independent polling sociological institute left, and remarkable that they still have been able to do work since the war began. But I don't have the figures in front of me, but consistent Levada polling over the past year has shown that something like under 10% of Russians blame Russia for the war. Okay, that's like understandable or predictable, but under 10% blame Ukraine for the war in Ukraine. And it's like 50% or something. You have to look at the exact figures. Blame the United States and NATO. Then you get this chicken egg question about, is that because of propaganda narratives, not just over the past year, but over the past 20 years? Or is it because that actually fits comfortably with the worldview of many Russians, that that's just the most comfortable and preferable narrative for many Russians to live in? And I think it's the latter. Again, but if there wasn't a propaganda output to sort of buttress and confirm that narrative, would people begin to question it and adopt other ones? I don't know. But you can't. It becomes impossible to unravel. But the idea that propaganda alone is kind of creating a set of circumstances that wouldn't exist otherwise, I think is definitely false. And another interesting, maybe even more important Levada poll is ask something like, are you paying attention? Are you following events in Ukraine? And I know over the summer, it got to about 50% not following. Then because of mobilization, more people personally felt implicated and attention went back up. And I haven't checked again, but I think it's come back to about 50% of not following, which suggests to me that this is not quite the question you're asking, but related, that many Russian people, perhaps the majority, kind of implicated in the war, not through their support, but through their indifference. And that is not really a question of propaganda, right? The idea that many Russian people don't see themselves as somehow have managed to otherize the war, like don't see it as something that's it's their concern only to the degree that it impacts them personally in the most narrow sense. Like if I am mobilized, or my son is mobilized, my husband, then it's your concern. But like that's the maximum radius of your interest in the war. Anything beyond that doesn't seem particularly relevant to you. And that's a Russian habit, I guess I've written about in my book or throughout, this idea of or not just a retreat, because the retreat suggests you were there in the first place, but just the idea that most Russian people don't see themselves as kind of political subjects, in the sense that sort of able to influence events, and therefore, if you can't influence events, why be concerned about events outside of your immediate sphere? That's a very embedded Russian habit that I don't think is a result of just propaganda.
I wanted to ask about the mythology surrounding this war. So we all heard that since it was started in Ukraine, Ukrainians started calling the Russian army orcs and Russian Mordor. And I've heard from personal from a lot of Ukrainian friends saying, yeah, well, waiting for Gavin to comment on. So I guess my first question is, have you encountered this kind of mythological view of war and Ukrainians on themselves, and why do you think that is? And second is not so much a question, but a comment. You said that when you went to Ukraine in February 2022, no one thought that the war would happen, but that is true. But the interesting part, again, mythological one, is that it seems that Putin is very much into neurology, or whatever he thinks neurology is. And that's why some people were concerned about the 22nd of February 2nd, 22, which that the war would happen on that day. But actually, he led Donbas and Lugansk People's Republics independent on that day, and there was that 2 days later. So and the same thing was with Georgia when they started the invasion on 8th August 2008. So that was just a comment. But
Yeah, no, I mean on that, like, I guess we all knew, those of us who covered Russia, that Putin was into various esoterica, including numerology, like taking, rejuvenating baths in the blood of antler blood or in Altai, like. But the idea that like he would actually launch an invasion of another country based on like numbers, I mean, I don't know if that time hopefully will reveal that mystery, but like that was maybe not one of the many things that was kind of too insane to actually contemplate, but perhaps turned out to be reality. On the mythology question, I don't know what to say other than yes, like I've noticed that exists. I don't know how much that's Ukraine specific versus just what happens to a country at war, especially a country that has been invaded and is physically not just at war, but its own territory is being contested. That maybe is a universal human reaction when you create mythologies about yourself, mythologies about your aggressor, and that there is one of the many overlapping levels or sources of trauma for Ukrainians is this idea that to a certain degree, not of course in the way that Putin would mean it, talking about a kind of brother nation or with very different implication in history, but nonetheless, like Russians are for Ukrainians like maybe not brothers, but close relatives from whom they were, especially after 2014, were not naive about what they were capable of, but still, like it does feel like a violation and a stab in the back from someone from whom you didn't expect maybe anything all that great, but nothing so treacherous either. So I think that's also led to mythology as a form of explaining what for many Ukrainians still remains unexplainable.
We can take a few more questions.
Sure.
I'm honest, I'm the historian here, and I had a question about something that you mentioned earlier in your talk, and this is the question of this like exodus of intellectuals and the intelligentsia out of Russia elsewhere, to Europe, to the Caucasus, to America. My friends are mostly who love Russia are also mostly intellectuals, academics, and they are kind of waiting this out in a way in Berlin, like you, and in the Caucasus, and it seems like that time is kind of running out for that. I mean, visa restrictions are coming back for them. All the generous institutions that are funding them and giving them these grants for like at-risk scholars and whatnot are kind of drying up. And I mean, it seems to me like this is becoming unsustainable, especially people who are studying Russia and are writing about Russia. It's really hard to do that also professionally abroad. How do you kind of part of this? I was wondering what you see the future of this kind of mass liberal intellectual exodus out of Russia looking like in the future, if you can predict.
Well, you're right in that it does. The anniversary of the war is both a kind of meaningless date in many aspects, but also has some significant in others. In that, for those Russians who left as a result of the war, it's a reminder for them. If inside Ukraine, it's a reminder or kind of proof that the war, this was not a quick war and therefore is unlikely to be one. And the same thing is true about Russians who found themselves in exile, that, this is not a question of us finding a place to live for a few months to wait this out, but this is now potentially life. And most people understandably didn't leave Russia prepared for or embarking on a whole new life in exile. And only now is that starting it's dawning on people and also forcing various logistical, administrative implications and realities. And I know the world a bit more of Russian journalists, and there it seems like it's inevitable or obvious that either, if you're in Russia, effectively impossible to do journalism, at least in the way we would understand it. And if you're outside of Russia, that means now setting up more long-term structures about how and where you're going to do it. Your sister wrote a very good story about the problems of Dost, which the television channel that ended up in Latvia, and now is en route or already has. They wrote about it in the piece. I should remember the details more thoroughly, but has run into various problems in Latvia and is now moving to or has moved to Amsterdam. And that's one example of the difficulties facing Russian media in exile and how sustainable it is long term. And how those journalists continue to report on Russia is a big question. Also, one thing I've heard very interestingly from friends who've remained in Moscow is that there's a growing split among the kinds of audiences that say would have watched Dosht or read Medusa a year ago, that there's a kind of skepticism or disinterest, distrust in exile projects of any kind among those who stayed, and that people in Moscow are gravitating toward other people in Moscow, even if, say, in a vacuum, their values or taste wouldn't align with such people like Ksenia Sobchak or Alexei Benediktov have found kind of new audiences, from what I understand, in Moscow because they're there. And so they have a kind of credibility among people who are there that people at Dosht, I'm generalizing here, but still, don't, because this split mentally, politically, psychically between those who stayed and those who left is it's real, and I think it's inevitable. It's going to deepen with time. And so I also I have nothing but greatest admiration for places like Dosht and Medusa and others, but you know, how they continue to stay relevant for their primary audience, the Russian audience back home, is going to be a big question, because and I've noticed it a bit even in my own social world too, that people who stayed, but it's true. It's like they're not wrong that I don't totally understand their lives and the pressures they're under, and complications and just the logistical hurdles, right? Just like Moscow went from being this really vibrant sort of Singapore-esque place in terms of its efficiency, right? Like Apple Pay came to, I mean, banal example, but still, like Apple Pay came to Moscow long before it came to San Diego. Like I was used to paying with my phone for years when people in San Diego would like look at me strangely when I tried to hold my phone up to the credit card machine. But like all of that is gone. So anyway, this is banal, stupid examples, but maybe not when you actually live there day in and day out, and like life has just suddenly become annoying and a slog. And here I am in Berlin, seemingly living my best life, and that of course can create some schisms, and those kinds of personal schisms can become also, or do become, kind of collective, social, political, with time. And I think preserving the link between exile Russia and Russia is going to be really tricky.
In your talk with Ukrainians, do you hear that they want to have the war carried to the Russian homeland, or do you think that they understand that it can't be done, or may not strategically be in their interest?
I mean, difficult to say, and I probably should add retroactively this caveat to everything I said about the Ukrainian public mood before, which is, of course, like big country with a vigorous, historically before the war, kind of public civic sphere. Like Ukrainians argue with each other, and there is no one Ukrainian opinion about anything, least of all, you know, what should be done in regards to the war. That said, I don't find many people interested in sending troops into Russia proper. There are more kind of gung-ho elements who do favor that. How realistic that is, I don't know, but in any case, that's not a representative opinion. What I'd say is more representative, and then you get into kind of parsing, maybe not legally, but functionally de facto, what is Russian territory, like how much should Ukraine insist on the return of Crimea, for example. That's more an area of debate. The Donbas, especially parts of the Donbas that were occupied since 2014. I think when you start to have some conversations with Ukrainians, including some in the political arena, about what that would actually mean, not just the military means to liberate those territories, but like the reconstruction and the reintegration process after, if it's been fraught in a place like Izium that was occupied for 6 months, imagine the difficulty in reincorporating those territories and the people in those territories who've been under occupation for 8+ years. It would be a really enormous task. So there's some room for healthy debate among Ukrainians about what the full return of their territory means, and is it February 23rd, 2022 territory? Is it February 2013 territory? I think there it's really going to come down to what the Ukrainian army can deliver. And that's what I alluded to earlier, talking about why on the Ukrainian side, there's still the imperative to fight rather than negotiate, because Ukrainians think there's still more territory to be won back. And I think, this is just a guess, obviously, but that Ukrainian public opinion may begin to congeal around what is militarily achievable. Like that will become the de facto majority position in Ukraine, however, after many rounds of offensives, counteroffensives, when it seems like the lines have really settled in a way that Ukraine is not going to be able to move further, that may become by default the Ukrainian position, but that's just a guess.
So I'm just asking, as a photographer, when you're reporting in Ukraine, how closely are you working with photographers, and how does that affect your process?
More closely than I really ever have before. It's just, I guess, part of the New Yorker culture process. It wasn't anything I consciously chose, but more often than not, I mean, basically almost every story I've ever worked on before the war, I went off and did my thing. Sometime, weeks, months, return visits, whatever. And like when I was done, effectively, when I had written a draft and the draft was then actually moving toward publication, then the photo department would read it and send someone back to where I had been, in most cases, to photograph the place or the subjects or whatever. And oftentimes I never even went. If it was far away, if it was close, I might just go because I was interested in seeing the people again or hang out with the photographer, why not? But if it was far away, I would go, and sometimes never even met the photographer. With the war, that's changed a lot, and I've worked with photographers in ways I never did before, like actually being out in the field with them, which is can be just fun. It's nice to have company. That's the morale boost to have another person out with you, and it can also feel and maybe is safer in some cases. But really, it's just like it's easier to process these experiences and navigate through them with good company. And thankfully, the photographers I've worked with have definitely been that. Also, it can be productive to talk through the story and to get input from the photographer about what they're seeing. Not all the time, but some of the photographers I've worked with, in the case of Izum, really talented photographer who was a friend from Moscow long before Ukraine, Emil Juke, young German photographer who's very, very talented, and we were in a Zoom together. But he speaks Russian, so whereas in other cases, frankly, sometimes I could end up being a bit of a kind of fixer producer for the photographers if they didn't speak the language, which fine. Like I'm interested in the overall product here, so I'll do what I have to do. And they have other skills that are compensated by lack of language. But in Emil's case, it was the full package. He had been to Ukraine many times. He understood the story in a kind of big picture sense. He spoke the language, so we could really work like a repertorial team where it almost didn't matter who was doing text and who was doing photos. But even that said, with Emil, there did come a point where it was clear that we had different interests or needs, and like at a certain point, me going to do the third interview with someone because I really want to get deep. I just feel like if I see them one more time for a couple hours, we'll get to some new psychic, emotional space. Like Emil doesn't need to spend the 6th hour with the same subject to get. There's probably diminishing returns there in terms of the portrait he's able to get, or in fact, in some cases, this often happens. Why I feel lucky and also sympathetic to photographers, let alone videographers. How many people will sit and talk with you when you just have a notebook in your lap, but and there's no circumstances want to be photographed. And I was less interested, for example, in what Emil needed to do and ultimately serve the story, kind of atmospheric pictures of the Zoom post-occupation. Okay, I want to wander around the city a bit and just get a feel for it, but I don't like he doesn't need to sit there for 6 hours with one person. I don't need to like stand on the same street corner for 6 hours just to get like the exact, because when the tank crosses in front of the church and it's just like, it'll be perfect. Like I'll let Emil do that. So we did, despite enjoying working together, and it was fun to be together, especially because in Izum those days, there was no power, heat, or water, and we were squatting in a basically empty, like an apartment that someone fled. And a neighbor who had who walked around with like a keychain of 200 keys for the neighborhood, people who had left, they had given her keys. We squatted in an apartment, in a cold apartment, and like made dinner in the courtyard on an open flame, and like that was fun. Like that was like something that would have been definitely not fun to do alone, became actually kind of fun to do with Emil, even if at like by the end we were spending more time apart than together during the day.
Okay, last question.
So Seymour Hirsch recently published a Substack about claiming that the United States is responsible for the destruction of the Orange Street pipeline. A large criticism of that was that they were highly reliant on anonymous sources. How would you describe sort of your process for journalistic integrity and talking to people and you casting a value judgment on what you believe is true, what you believe is not?
I've talked about it a lot today, but maybe the most relevant case study is this story about collaborators from Izum, because these were high stakes stories or allegations, right, about people who had potentially collaborated with the Russian army, and some of whom were facing very serious criminal prosecution as a result. People can go to prison for many, many years for this, depending on their alleged crime. And in other cases, even when it wasn't a question of criminal prosecution, people were effective social outcasts and were being judged quite harshly by their neighbors. And everyone had a story. I didn't meet anyone in Izum who was like, yes, I love Russia. I wish Russia was still here. And of course, I helped the Russian army. Even people who were accused credibly of essentially having those attitudes, like no one was going to cop to that now that Izum was back under Russian control. And everyone had a story that was pretty compelling. And maybe I'm like overly not empathetic, credulous, perhaps, as my Ukrainian journalist friend who was with me at times tried to convince me that I was letting people, tell me a tall tale and not pushing them hard enough. But there was a degree of unknowability about what really happened in Izum with these stories, right? Did like the neighbor really approach the Russian troops on her own to denounce her neighbor, to get him arrested? Like, did the other person in Izum like really buddy up with the Russian occupying administration to get more humanitarian aid for herself that she hoarded while her neighbors went hungry? And all those people have an explanation about what they did, or like the director of the principal of the school who I wrote about in that piece, who was known in town to be a really pro-Ukrainian patriot. She was the school principal of the only Ukrainian language or main Ukrainian language school in Izum, and she, to everyone's mystification and disappointment, agreed to collaborate with Russia and reopened the school under the Russian program. And she has a very compelling story as to why she did that, and under immediate physical danger and threat of being killed, which I do believe for her was very real in the moment. But there's also, if you go talk to, in that case, the head of the Izum Department of Education, he'll tell you an equally convincing story about why that's all effectively BS. And she's just telling you this, and telling everyone who listen now that's what happened, when in fact, if you look at this or that bit of evidence from the time, that it's clear that wasn't quite the case. And there are lots of stories like that where afterwards people say, they were going to kill me, or I ran out of food and I had no choice. And then you talk to someone else who convincingly argues, well, of course they did have a choice. Look at this or that set of circumstances. And I'm getting to the answer to your question. The way I chose to engage with that is to make the mystery kind of the point, or like to embrace the unknowability of what happened, and I had a luxury in that story because that allows for it. A story like Nord Stream, when you're writing like an investigative piece, it's a little less rewarding for the reader to be like, well, the mystery. No, you want to like solve an investigative piece. You more want to solve the mystery than to like just leave the mystery as the point of the story.
A podcast could get away with that. Nobody knows at the end of this journey.
Yeah. So maybe this is it's my cop out in my story selection. I'm also allowing for a greater proportion of unknowability than other pieces would require. But there is a way. The fog of war is both a cliche but real, and I think that's also can be interesting to capture. That can actually be a virtue of the story, and I hope in the case of the story from Izium that the mystery and the unknowability and this kind of black box nature of what really happened was not just like allowable, but actually part of or part of the point of the story.
Josh, thank you for coming. Thank you for answering these questions so thoughtfully, and thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.
It's your hard work.
Oh, yeah. Thanks.
John, and yeah. Yeah.
Okay, likewise. Yeah.
Are you on?
I don't know about soon, but I mean, eventually, I mean, it's sort of inevitable, but I don't know. Thanks.
I just wonder, when you were before, and I'm talking to Kharkiv. So there is a lot of people believe that war is coming because 100,000 Russian troops were along the whole border. So it's not only from the east side, it would be
Sure,
and
yeah.
they build it.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Yeah, likewise. Glad we can pull this together.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Да, да. Здесь, я футболник говорю, не говорю. Я подавался еще до вот, так что я стараюсь перебывать, но по возможности. Буклак, дальше как включались. Я вообще без класс. Ну, это что? Нет, я завтра поеду в Москве. И в данном случае ну ладно. Давай. Пока. Well, hopefully we all have this to be. This is about, it's not about the words, but rather. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Great.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm more inclined to go incredible. I mean, like, okay, it's one of those cases where. It needs to be accurate, like it's about the trajectory or like vector. And that resonates, that just sounds true.
Well, I think part of their portfolio.
Not with the solely with a lot of time, this internal polling, that's all it is.
Yeah, or it is.
Yeah, it is.
That's also very true. It's like, most Russian, I should mention this in the remarks, but like, there are some sociologists that would like agree to trust models. Also, and they talk about like, 10% on either end. 10% has really sort of rabid, people, 10% like opposition and they're not up for wars, they're also not scared. Stop it. They're all- I don't know. Thank you. Now, it's helpful. It's like when I'm yeah. My pleasure. Okay, thanks so much. Stay in touch. See you. It makes sense. Then of course, things you do is not something that happened in the embassy. That's right. July.
You have to stay whatever.
That was a long time. Oh, okay, that's right. Here's an interesting way of spending your vacation days. Thanks. Okay, cool. Thanks for coming. Yeah, enjoy New York. Okay. That's yeah, thanks so much for coming. That's right. I'm in yours. Yeah. I'm rich. Yeah. Really just since I arrived last night. I mean, I'm going to the bar and just to kick it with Nathan and I was up there in Nashville. Yeah. I was like, sorry, I was so embarrassed to be like, I can have like 9:30. I just have the tea on this particular day. What can I see you truly like tomorrow morning?
Do they do yes, I'm free tomorrow morning. I couldn't come to the city, couldn't talk to them, it's like this. That's fine. It's like, I'm just. Yeah, so that is like. First level, it was like a big one. Yeah, it texted me. I have 2 days for you. With the San Diego in here. This, she's up the NBC. Facebook is bad. She's fucking. And this is the story. Amazing, right? See national. And then this is. It's like serious. Like professional. That's why I do it. I don't know. I did that. Great. Thanks. Hey, thanks for coming. I'm gonna. So I think I'm thinking until basically the 12th. So I'm staying near Flats. I have a single, and I'll let you know because I won't know until I know more. Okay. It's according to kids. These days, my focus is so narrow. Wow. Something like sure thing I can. There's some great, I don't know, it's not all things related, but I did a lot of reading. These I wrote about the World War II.
10 million, 5 million, and it keeps getting until it reaches the limit. So like
Don't rush.
Hello. You too. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for coming. Sure.
Look, just with Gabby's 2 years ago, not too.
Thank you, more hasn't.
Yeah.
More gray. Yeah, I do. I have to cut my hair more regularly, otherwise it starts to silver. Goes-
Yeah, I think that's our age.
Yeah. I blame the war. I blame the war. I blame food. Sure. Joe?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, where the Andrea, you know Andrea? Andrea, she here? No. Okay, all right, she said she was gonna come by, but not
We're going to.
okay.
Yeah, okay.
If should we call, do you think?
I did a.
Oh, look at you. Nice.
Well, you said to do it, and I was like, sure, and then.
Did I don't know if I, sorry, if I was like, as overbearing to be like,
No.
here's my reservation requirements for today. Can you sort that out, Karina, please? I'm gonna tell Sasha. You did, very likely.
But I don't have.
I hear that you're like, what she wrote me was that she was gonna try to come, just kind of talk, say my in between classes. Maybe.
No, these are 15 minutes. She wrote, I wrote. Not sure.
Downstairs. SID. Yeah, yeah. I'll tell them on the right around. You go say goodbye.
I think it would be too hard for me to do experience. And to what you're doing, which like invest in yourself in a way regardless of the institution. I think I would feel this pressure of like passive, like be a good student, but against like you don't feel like none of this matters. Like those opinions. Yeah, well, for sure. Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, no. Happy birthday. I know I had a feeling that was gonna happen. But yeah, he was. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was probably yeah, And Adrian, some of the chairs that are in here can be stacked up into on the teams, so there's actually. Thursdays are the bane of my existence. I know. They fall over on this shirt. Which chairs are those chairs? Yeah, let's put like a stack of blue chairs in here in case authors or whatever. Yeah. So that way they're not in the student lounge, like you have a couple action in here, yeah. I'm sorry, so can we do? Yeah. Okay, yeah, just something there.